I'm going to tell you today about the function of the protein alpha-synuclein, which is interesting for many of us who study Parkinson's disease because it aggregates into Lewy bodies. It is the main component of Lewy bodies, which are the hallmark of Parkinson's disease. As we define it today, patients have to have Lewy body pathology to have Parkinson's. Even though the linkage between Parkinson's disease and alpha-synuclein was made about 26 years ago now, we're still discovering new things about its function. So the cell is a complicated structure in the brain. Neurons are particular cells that help transmit information and process information. And we know that synuclein is present in one part of the neuron called the synapse, and that's the place where cells communicate with each other. Two different cells touch each other, a chemical signal is sent across the gap between the two cells, and we know that one of the functions of synuclein is to help with that transmission of information. So the chemical that's released is packaged into these little vesicles or little packets, and those packets are released out of the cell only when an electrical signal comes in. And one of the functions of alpha-synuclein is in regulating the process of that release of these vesicles. We know that synuclein may be doing several things in this structure in the cell. It helps cluster these packets of vesicles so that they're ready to be released when the signal comes. There's also evidence that it directly modulates the release process and how the proteins that are involved in releasing the vesicles. And then there's also evidence that the synuclein is important in absorbing those vesicles back up again so that they can be refilled with more neurotransmitter. So in the synapse, we have where most of the work on synuclein's function has been done over the last, let's say, 20 or 30 years. We have good evidence that it's involved in these different processes, but I think there's still a lot to be done to figure out exactly what it's doing there. And then synuclein was given its name because when it was first discovered, it was found in the synapse, but also in the nucleus. That's where the name synuclein comes from. It's a contraction of those two words. And so I am actually particularly interested in its functions in the nucleus. So the nucleus is another part of all cells, prominent in neurons as well, where the DNA that codes for basically the blueprint for how to make a cell function properly exists. And in the nucleus, we know much less about what synuclein's doing. There's evidence that it actually can bind DNA directly. There's evidence that it can bind some of the proteins called histones that package DNA. There's evidence that synuclein can modulate aspects of DNA chemistry like transcription. So the way that DNA encodes information is that there's a sequence of nucleic acids, and that gets read out by the cell to make another sequence of nucleic acids called RNA. And then the RNA is read out to make a sequence of amino acids, which are called a protein. And the proteins in the cell are the actual, most of the time, the actual machines, you could call them, that actually do things in the cell. But the information for how to make those is stored in the DNA. And so there's evidence that in that intermediate step of transmitting the information from DNA to protein via RNA, that synuclein is important for that process. My lab is particularly interested in a function of synuclein, which we think is important in regulating how DNA is repaired. So you can imagine this blueprint for how to make a neuron function properly has to survive in that neuron basically for the life of the person, because neurons in general, in most cases, don't divide, they don't replicate. So if you lose a neuron, it can't be replaced, and a neuron you have lives with you your whole life. And so keeping that information faithful is critically important. And there are very elaborate mechanisms cells have evolved to repair DNA damage, to keep that information faithful. And we're particularly interested in this idea that one of the relatively unexplored functions of synuclein is to actually help repair the damaged DNA properly so that neurons can live a long time. Now, how this relates to disease is, of course, an interesting question. And I would say that's still very open. Some people think that synuclein when it aggregates, takes on a toxic new function that's damaging cells. Other people think that actually when you have one of these aggregates in the cell, like a Lewy body, maybe the normal function of synuclein is removed, and that could actually be playing a role. So we call these gain of function and loss of function, and I think it's still to be determined actually whether it's one of these processes or both that are related to why cells die when they have Lewy bodies in them.